I bow down to all my mothers and sisters here and try to reach with a great sense of tenderness and deep anguish. My great mothers and sisters of the year suffered to uphold their dharma, which they thought was the most precious thing in their lives. So, with that, I'll start my lecture on Sati. This is a photograph, a picture of Sati, which is actually it's a painting, and it's supposed to indicate Rani Padmini of Chittor. So go to the next slide, please. Yeah, yeah. So I just want to start with a shloka, which I think is very important, and the meaning of the shloka is here. Vibhyat pativrata sparisham kurute bhanumanapi somo gandhavaschapi swapaitrayananyatha. If there's a pativrata lady who's there in this earth, even the sun and the moon shudder to touch her because they want to touch her and become pure of themselves. The gods, the sun and the moon gods. That's the shloka which is there. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay. The objectives of this lecture is to clarify and put into perspective narratives on Sati in Western discourse. That's you already know about it. To educate and empower the Indian community. To provide research input to organizations who are concerned with the quality of educational narratives on India. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an extract from a text which is there, and you can see for yourselves how Sati is portrayed. I'll just go to the one which is outlined in red. The issue of Sati, the Hindu ritual suicide of the widow on the funeral pyre of her husband, raged in India in the 19th century. I think that's a very important keyword which comes to our mind, saying that it probably existed all over India and it was going on in a very large scale. Okay, next one. So there are other similar references in the history textbooks which we will see later. That's just a sample, so that but we want to give our perspective. I think I'm giving it to her.
Maybe if you come to this side of the
it's okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Is it all right now?
That works.
Okay. So the common Western references which are there is that the former Hindu practice of a widow throwing herself onto her husband's funeral pyre, a widow who has committed Sati. That's how it is said in the common reference. You should see the word throwing is it's a word which implies a negative sensitivity here, negative sense. And then we have the word Sati, which is also spelled as Sati, which is, if you see the ancient text, or not ancient, the old British text, it's actually spelled as S-U-T-T-E. Next slide, please. But if you actually go and see how Sati is defined in our ancient text, holy texts, it starts with the Yajurveda. In the Yajurveda, there is a mantra which goes like this. Striyas yajeya kshiyashtahecha kada bhutanya yakshata pashavo mama bhutani anubandhyosmyaham vibhuhu striyas satihi tavume pugumsa ahuhu. It says that a lady who has understood the Atma, the life principle which exists in us, the Parabrahman, the Supreme Spirit which exists in us, she is called as Sati. That's what this thing says. So, of course, the Merriam-Webster dictionary has a very different connotation. It has the act of or custom of a Hindu widow burning herself to death or being burned to death on the funeral pyre of her husband. Okay, we'll discuss all this as we go further. There's another definition of Sati, which is, of course, the Puranic definition, which is there in the Shiva Puranas. That is, I'm sorry, not the other one. This is the normal definition of Pativrata. You've heard about that. A lady who follows her husband, her in all the walks of life, and they together walk the path of Dharma. So that's another definition of Sati. The word Sati also means, the old English word of soothsayer actually comes from the word Sat, means truth. So that's something incidental, I just wanted to say that to you. Next slide, please. So Sati also was, in the Puranic way, also refers to Ma Parvati, who gave herself up because her husband was insulted in Dakshayagnya, so she's also called as Sati. And also a lady who is, after her husband has passed away, leads a life of an ascetic, she's also called as a Sati. So next slide. If you really see any of the ancient Indian literature, you don't find any reference which says Sati is actually equal to bride burning. So you'll never find any reference. Okay, it's very important to know that. It was only during the early 1800s that Sati entered a Western discourse to exclusively imply that widow burning on a funeral pyre, on a husband's funeral pyre. The technical terms which were actually used for a lady who was undergoing Sati was, which is much more complicated, like Sahamaranam, Sahagamanam, Anvarohanam, Anumaranam. These are the Sanskrit terms which are there in the literature to describe a lady who burns on the funeral pyre of her husband. Next slide, please. Okay, in this slide, can you just keep pressing the keeper? So you find that Sati, this widow burning or bride burning is not something not exceptional. One more. It's not really exceptional in India. It was there in all over it was there among the Germans, among the Greeks, the Scythians, the Scandinavians, the Slavs, and then you also find that during about 300 BC, when Alexander invaded the northwestern part of India, he did see some of the Scythians. That's actually another probably a distorted word for Kshatriyas. He found that the kings, when he died, his wife was burned along with him on the funeral pyre. Next slide, please. It's also there in Bali. So let's see how let's see if you go and recount how Sati is basically. Is there any references starting from the Vedic literature? Let's run through all the scriptural evidences which are there, and then you can also ask questions during the question answer session. So that there's enough material for you to discuss about this. So in the Vedic literature, there is no evidence at all. Whatever Vedic literature is available with us, there's no evidence at all that Sati has to be, that it's a requirement for every lady to burn on the funeral pyre if her husband dies. So there's no evidence at all. There is some controversy on two areas. One is in Mahanarayana Upanishad. Of course, that is interpolation and nobody accepts that. There is one also in the Rig Veda, and that actually Taslima Nasreen, she's written a work called No Place for Women. She takes that and she quotes it. But that actually means for a person, for a lady, what are her duties for when she's living with her husband. So it never meant for something to do with a wife burning on the funeral pyre of her husband. Next slide, please. Of course, that doesn't imply, during the Vedic times that Sati was not taking place. I guess they can't say that. It's only that there's no reference in the scriptures. Okay. So in Ramayana, there are no incidents at all of Sati. None of Vali's wives, Ravana's wives, or Dasharatha's wives underwent Sati. They all lived a long time after they all passed away. So that is true. And then Mahabharata, you had a lot of, there's a huge war took place, a lot of Kshatriyas died. They're all the wives of these Kshatriya kings and queens, they all underwent Sati? No. In fact, if you read the Mahabharata original texts, you find that when the king is consigned to the fire after he's died in battle, you find that his chariot, his swords, all his weapons, everything are burnt along with him, but there's no reference that his wife was burnt with him. So that's very clear in Mahabharata. It very clearly describes how the kings were all burnt after their death, after the Mahabharata war. Next slide, please. Of course, Bhagavad Gita, there's no reference at all. In Mahabharata, again, you have King Pandu's wife, Madri, out of her own volition, committed Sati, and not Kunti, who was another wife of Pandu. There are also incidents like Vasudeva's queen, that is Krishna's father's queens, like Devaki, Bhadra, Rohini, and Madhura. They all committed Sati. And Krishna's queens, Rukmini, Gandhari, and a couple of them did commit, including Jambavati, did Sati, but not Satyabhama and other queens. They all went to the forest for tapas. Okay, next slide, please. Then coming to the more recent times, maybe 2000 years or so, in Kumar Sambhava, which is a very great work of Kalidasa, there's an instant that Manmatha's wife, Rati, when Lord Shiva burns him to ashes for disturbing his samadhi, for disturbing him from the state of samadhi, his wife Rati wanted to commit Sati, but an Akashavani, means a voice from the heaven, said, no, you shouldn't do it, that's not right. And so she doesn't commit Sati. And then in Kama Sutra, which is a very famous text, there is King Varahamila, who actually praises the great courage and of women who are committed sati. And of course, there are a lot of epigraphs, and not a lot, and scattered epigraphs around India, which give indication that sati was committed around India. They are scattered, but there are also epigraphs which are around India, which also says that a lot of people stop people from doing sati within the Hindu community. So there are a lot of epigraphs, and you can see a work by P.V. Kane, who is you may not know his name. He was a Bharat Ratna. And he, in his work, has cited that there are a lot of epigraphs within India which show that within the Indian community there are a lot of opposition to this practice of sati. Okay, and that's what he says in his book. So, but it is there in the Gupta period, it's there in the Maurya kings. You see that in the Chola dynasties in the south, in the Karnataka kings, the Peshwas, of course, Rajasthan, Nepal kings, and so on. Next slide. I just want to, this is incidental, this Jawahar Act, which is, that when women are subjected to inhuman and very terrible atrocities on their bodies, when they are captured in war, to avoid that, for them honor is great. And so you know that in Rajasthan, the Rajputs, the wives of Rajputs have undergone unspeakable, and it's very touching story. If you visit that place, I recommend all of you, when you have a chance, to go and visit those areas. We are not glorifying them. You may think we are glorifying them. It's not true. You should see it from an angle where for them honor was much greater than anything else. For them life is an honor. If you have a balance, probably honor is great for them. And I think by that way, these Rajput kings, if you see the entire area of North India, the Hinduism is now thriving on maximum in Rajasthan, and it's because of the innumerable and enormous sacrifices made to maintain the culture, not only by the men who had a continuous war with the sultans of Delhi, but also the women folk who had maintained their ancient way of culture, way of life. So they will not compromise their way of life, and that's for them is more important. So next slide, please. So in this text of Hinduism, what's the reasons for sati? It's her, when a wife commits sati, the purpose is that she, by that particular yajna, it's called a yajna itself in the text, she pulls out her husband from very dangerous circumstances, because life is a continuum. Life doesn't end here. It continues in other spheres of living. There are other spheres people live, and they live as per their space-time in that sphere. It could be tens and thousands of years. That's the belief. And so that they don't fall into the bad worlds and suffer and undergo a lot of torture, so that to save her husband, they did this, to save their father and mother, and to save their whatever in-laws from all kind of difficulties, they did this particular act. And of course to live with their husband wherever and enjoy life as they enjoyed life with their husband here. Next slide, please. And let's take a quick look at sati, on the incidences of sati in India, the occurrences, just one at a time, slowly, one at a time. So you find the first, somewhere this in the time of 1800s, of course in 1600s there was one instance which is reported available in Surat, and then you, of course you have in Bengal, which is well known, of course, and the next one you have also in Karnataka, in Kashi, and then of course in Tamil Nadu. And if you see the population, if you see the statistics at that time, you see the population of India is about 200 million. And the total incidence in this period of about 30 years is about 2,500. That's the data which is available from the East India Company records. Next slide, please. So, if you actually see this very act of sati, which was actually passed by Lord William Bentinck in the year 1829, you will find that if you see the preamble to this law, if you just distill that, what's the conclusion you have? Next, you will find that it's a very rare practice. Next one. And it's shocking to Hindus themselves, and that's what you get from the preamble. And this is not endorsed by the big scriptures of India. That is the Vedas, Manu Dharma Shastra, Yajnavalkya Smriti, Ashwayana Smriti. These are big stuff. Of course, there are some smritis which are there where it prescribes them, but they are all very obscure smritis which is there. Next slide, please. So, there is no prescription of Sati in Vedas and the major smriti texts. That's our concluding remarks. We are coming close to the end of the lecture. It finds mention in some obscure smritis. It is there. That is in Angirasa Smriti and Vaishnava Smriti. In Vaishnava Smriti, it's optional. In Angirasa Smriti, it is mentioned as compulsory. And there's a practice of Sati was generally confined to the community of kings and nobles. That's generally true. Of course, the practice did spread to the higher the communities, the priestly class, especially in Bengal. Okay, and a lot of the epigraphs and stone monuments which are carried all over India imply veneration. Many of the time, there are also epigraphs which were saying that they were prevented from doing so also when some of the wives of kings and kings wanted to commit sati. From the East India Company records, the incidence sati can be set about 350 to 500 per year between 1810 and 1830. Next slide, please. The practice, of course, had higher incidence in Bengal, and that is because there is something called Daya Bhaga, which was I think progressive at that time, where all the property after the death of a husband goes to the wife. So probably there was some misuse in that. That's why probably there's higher incidence in Bengal, and of course the force of tradition also which is there. The practice of Islamic invaders also forced widows and other women to commit sati, especially if they didn't have a sufficient security blanket or cover around themselves. And the instance of misuse of sati for monetary gains has also been reported, and we can see that also in the East India Company literature. Next, please. So, actually, this is a great, P.D. Kane is a Bharat Ratna. He says Indians should never be ashamed of sati. This man is a Bharat Ratna. He has done great work. He's got the history of Dhammachaitra. There's 14 volumes. It's the mother document for all Hindus here. Everybody should get acquainted with that. It gives you so much of source material. Lovely source material. Gives an insider view to things. So if any Hindu is here, from any Hindu organization, you must read this book. It's big, it's tough, but it's worthwhile. If you're doing some serious work, try to fight prejudices which are portrayed in the history textbooks in the Western Hemisphere, you should have a look at it. Okay, next slide please. I just wanted to share with you, of course I don't want to share with you what the evangelicals have basically written. It's pretty, I would say it's pretty hard to read that. There's plenty. I should share that with you some of the time. But the early Western travelers, most of the early Western travelers, you see what is their report, it's pretty different. You see, this is one of the examples. The early Portuguese traveler, he said, if I knew of a lady about to become a sati, I will not fail to go and see her and honor by my presence her funeral with that compassionate affection which such a great conjugal fidelity and love seem to deserve. That's what he has written. I just wanted to put it as a sample. Next slide, please. So what's the position of our organization? Is about historical research. Sati as a practice was extreme. It was heart-rending, but it was pretty rare. Next slide. Irrespective of reasons for the practice, modern thought does not concur or condone it, while deeply respecting the values piously cherished by our ancient mothers and sisters. Abuse of the practice was rare, criminal and condemnable. Next slide. The extension of the practice of sati reflects societal changes and the dynamic nature of our Bharati Sanskriti. And it's totally wrong to attribute sati to Sanatana Dharma. It is not right. But you have to examine it in the context of ancient societal value systems, gender roles, and role of external forces and contests. Next slide. So all life, but most certainly that of the life giver, is sacred. You're all here. I bow down to you once again. And you should preserve, cherished, and supported, and honored and protected. The Vedas definitely condemn suicide. In fact, there is a lot of literature in ancient literature where one lawgiver contests what is written about sati and says he calls it as suicide. This is not right, and there's a lot of debate which goes on. So a lot of internal churning has happened. So people should be aware of that. Next slide, please. I stop. This is my last slide. This is Rani Padmini of Chittor, and these are the handprints. Typical. I'm not sure whether this is the real handprint, but normally all these ladies give their handprints before they, ascend the funeral pyre, and it's pretty touching. You should go and see that. Very moving. So with that, I'll conclude my lecture, and during the question.